I'm an avid hunter. I go every season and I love it. More often than not, I don't kill any game, but I just love getting out and into the woods. I don't know if you're familiar with hunting season in Pennsylvania, but during late November, rifle season is in full swing. It was already the second week of the season, and I had yet to bag any deer, so I was eager to get to it early in the morning, and I did. I normally get up at around 5 a.m. and drive to my hunting spot. It's private land that my grandfather owns. Him and I are the only two who hunt on it, and the rest is posted to hunters. And the only others on that land are employed on my grandfather's farm. I had originally planned on calling my grandfather when I woke up and asking him if he wanted to tag along, but the weather was more than horrendous in the morning. The snow was pouring down and the wind was really strong. I love hunting in the snow, but it almost made me decide not to go. So I knew he wouldn't want to. The roads were really bad, so it took me a bit longer to drive there. Normally, the sun would be starting to rise by now. However, it was overcast and snowing. Regardless of the snow, I walked up to my spot. It was directly behind my grandfather's house, over a hill and back about 100 to 150 yards. Almost immediately upon sitting in my spot, I hear things moving all around me. Honestly, I didn't pay too much attention to it. It could have been a number of things, but it was still pitch black, and the thought of it was kind of creeping me out. But there wasn't much I could do. It's not like I can shoot at anything, so I just ignored it and continued to wait. It wasn't much longer after that I began hearing something walking just over the ridge to my right. At this point, there's barely enough light to see my feet, so even if it was a deer, there was still nothing I could do. However, I could tell it wasn't a deer. I just assumed it was my grandfather walking to his spots, which is just a short walk from mine. But the lights in the house were off, and if he was up here, I'm sure he'd let me know prior. Even if it wasn't him, it was a hunter. Albeit hunting illegally. I still wanted to let him know I was here. So I turned on my flashlight and pointed into his direction, flashing it several times. Again, even if it was a deer, I couldn't shoot it. So I felt it was better to be safe rather than sorry. Nothing happened after that. After I flashed my light, the noise stopped, which was really odd. I didn't see them turn back or hear them, so I figured they either A, sat down right there after seeing my light, which was considered extremely rude, or B, I didn't hear them walk off. I just assumed it was the latter. An hour or so passes, and finally the first sights of daylight start to shine through. It's still snowing, and the snow is falling in entire snowballs, rather than snowflakes, so visibility is pretty limited. I, around this time, noticed that an odd-looking lump protruding from a group of trees. The shrubs atop the hill that separates me and my granddad's house, right where I had movement earlier. It looked like a mound of dirt. However, it was sticking out from the side of a tree, so obviously it wasn't dirt. Naturally, I raised my rifle to take a closer look. I could tell immediately that I was looking at the side of an older-style camouflage coat. It took a minute, but it finally clicked. That was a person over there. I just thought it was a hunter, so I didn't know what to do about it. I knew if he was hunting on our land illegally, and from that I could see he wasn't wearing anything orange, which is required of all hunters during the rifle season. And I could tell just from looking, whoever this was wasn't my grandfather. I sat there for a minute debating my next move, but I decided to call my granddad, at the risk of blowing his stunt if that was actually him over there. So, without taking my eyes off this guy, I put up my phone and dialed his number. To my dismay, he picked up, and I told him what was going on. So he told me that he'd make his way up, but I decided on my own to give this guy a whistle to let him know I see him. But he didn't react at all. After a few minutes, I started to walk up to this guy. After walking a short distance, I could clearly see this guy, who was sound asleep tucked in between a shrub and a couple of trees. He obviously thought out here was a great place to lay down, as I would never be able to see him and his coat was not stuck out. And as I thought, he had no orange on. I gave him another whistle, much louder, and he woke right up, almost immediately shuffling over to hide his exposed coat. He had a nasty, scruffy beard and a gray hat. Honestly, he looked like a harmless old homeless man, probably in his 50s, but he had a perfect view of my granddad's home from his spot, and I had a pretty good idea that he was planning to do once my granddad left the house. Once this guy realized he'd been caught, and he'd saw a 6'5" mad guy carrying a rifle, he started freaking out. His face went pale, and almost instantly he tried to feed me some bullshit that he'd gotten lost during a drive with a group of other hunters. A drive as a coordinator pushed through a thicket in order to drive deer to hunters sitting at the edge of a designated driving area. However, the closest public game land is miles from this spot, so I knew it was a lie. He just wanted to keep on going on about how he was lost and how he fell asleep. He even went as far to make up a fake name on the spot. I just stood there and listened, making sure he didn't give me any fishy movements. I couldn't help but think that what this guy was going to do to my grandfather, God knows if he had the chance, and the thoughts pissed me off.
This is something I recently had happen to me a few weeks ago. I have more encounters while hunting, but I will share those another time if this goes all right. They're a bit longer and more strange. I am from southwest Georgia and live right on the Georgia-Alabama line. I was riding dirt roads one night with my friend and her younger sister. We were fishing earlier that evening and didn't have any luck, so we decided to get some beer and go for a ride. On into the night after riding dirt roads in between Lumpkin and Georgetown, we went to a spot I know pretty well. That was a swamp off the side of the dirt road. So we get out and decide to chill for a little while. About 30 minutes pass and I decide to walk down a little ways into the water and cast out my pole with some stank bait on it. My friend is behind me, standing beside the truck with her sister in the back seat. And for a few minutes, no one is talking and no music is playing. Then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my friend screams. And not just a scream, but a horror movie type bloody murder scream. Like it scares the living shit out of me, and I think someone just died type of scream. I go from complete and relaxing silence in the middle of a swamp in Georgia to a scream. It'll scare you, and I don't care who you are. So I turn around and I yell, "What's wrong?" As soon as I said that, something ran past me into the water. Keep in mind it is completely dark and my spotlight is in the truck. This thing, I don't know what it was, ran by me on two legs. It did not make one sound until it hit the water. It goes off into the water and it sounded heavy. And then all of a sudden, nothing. As if it either flew away, as silly as it may sound, or it went underwater. Because the noise stopped out in the middle of the swamp. It was moving so fast, if it would have hit the woods, I feel like I would have heard something, compared to it running on the clay. Now, all of this happened within a time frame of like 3 to 7 seconds. But, in my mind, this was all slow motion. I walked up to my friend and her little sister jumps out of my truck and is standing beside me. I asked what the hell happened, and they have no idea. But my friend said she looked over from her phone and saw something standing beside her, and she never heard a single thing walk up to her. Her little sister was on the other side of the back seat, and when she looked out the window, she said she saw a gray ear, but didn't say anything because she thought I was playing a joke or something on them. Putting the two together, the creature stood beside my friend and never made a sound for about 5 minutes until she screamed. All three of us confirmed it was on two legs. I've hunted here my whole life. It wasn't a deer for obvious reasons. It wasn't a coyote because it was too short. It wasn't a hog. It wasn't a deer. So, what could it have been? It obviously wasn't a small animal like a raccoon or a opossum. We don't have bears in South Georgia either. So I can honestly say, and even after asking people's opinions, from my 25 years of being on this earth, I have no idea what walked up on us that night in the woods.
I've actually had several paranormal encounters over the years. but this one has always struck me as particularly bizarre and frightening. This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to the incident, I wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed climbing, usually about to the halfway mark so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out in the dark. After watching the sunset until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice, calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this was routine and had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone in the woods ahead of me? Certainly I wouldn't have missed her. But as I said, she never entered those woods anyway. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place as her voice drew closer. I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine how exactly angry she was, or I could gauge how upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly, I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again, it wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly, and I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now," the voice that I originally believed to be her screamed just ahead of me. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste, even though my house wasn't very far away from there. Even though my house wasn't very far away from where I'd been standing, those woods had never become larger to me. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and into the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly, but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside of the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by my question, she told me that of course she hadn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that had happened. as clearly and as rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have just imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods has stayed with me till this day. I could still hear that voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it was a her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem to be explainable. None of them seem to make any sense. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off, not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known where to find me and my name? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. It probably shouldn't matter, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that, and I've never experienced anything out of the ordinary since, but I just can't explain this. If anybody has any possible explanation, please let me know.
I'll start by telling you a few things about me. I'm 18 years old and live in northern Canada in 2 different homes. One is with my father, who lives right in the middle of 222 acres of woods. We've got but a single neighbor, who is situated about 1 kilometer away. My second home is with my mother. She lives on the edge of a city, close to the woods and the main shopping center. The story is split into 3 parts, and believe me, it may sound crazy, but I swear, all of this is true. The first part of the story starts at my father's house. I'd often go for walks in the woods. It was peaceful and quiet. I'd always bring my 3 dogs for protection, a German Shepherd and 2 Australian Shepherds. Nothing ever happened in the woods. There was the occasional sighting of bears, and we found quite a few lynx tracks, but nothing out of the ordinary, until something started watching me from the woods. A black figure of sorts. At first, I thought it was just my paranoid mind playing tricks on me, so I shrugged it off. A few days passed since I first felt the strange watching presence. It was a cold day out. The sun was gone and the wind came from the north, making it even colder. It was around noon, and it was time for me to bring the dogs out for a walk. I brought them down to the road that leads to my house. Nobody was around and it was silent all over, except for the wind blowing through the tree leaves. I was calm, but then it felt like I was being followed. Of course, my dogs were following me, but this feeling was dark. I continued. It eventually turned back to go home. Everyone was gone, so I arrived to an empty house. As I was about to bring the dogs into their kennel, I noticed one of the Aussies was frozen in place. He was staring into the woods. I tried to get his attention, but he would not budge. I walked over to him, pat his head. He only growled, but not to me. He growled to whatever was in the woods. The dog was pacing, tail tucked between his legs and ears held back. That made me feel a little uneasy, since I'd been feeling watched or followed during the walk. It also meant I wasn't the only one who felt it. I decided to be safe and locked the door when I was inside. I'd like to say this feeling left after a while, but now, it only became more frequent. I had to lock and cover my windows at night because it felt as though someone was peering through them. I told people about it, especially those I lived with. They'd tell me it was a bear or maybe some ghost. A few even mentioned that it could be a stalker. I knew it was neither of these things. It just didn't feel right. Fast forward to about 3 months after the first occurrence. It's September, and the weather has begun to get colder. I was outside with my dogs cleaning some skulls I had recently gotten from a trapper. I was just minding my own business. All of my family members were gone, so I was left alone again. Then, I went near the forest and felt the dark presence again. It was so strange. I just couldn't shake it off as nothing. Scared, I went inside and decided to make myself some food in the comfort of my home. The fear left, and I felt safe again, until I heard the dreadful sound coming from the woods outside. It sounded like a man screaming, a deer howling in pain, and the low growl of a bear, all at once. It was the scariest thing I've ever heard in my life. I checked all the doors and ran to the second story of the house to hide. Not sure why I felt so much fear, since I heard nothing after that. But I called a relative, and they told me I was just hearing things. That night, I could barely sleep. I was afraid of whatever this thing was going to come inside. I kept seeing things in the shadows of the trees after this incident. It was hard to ignore. Eventually, I went to live with my mother in the city. I was there for a better chance at a job. I also had some friends to reunite with there. Once I moved, I met up with my childhood best friend. She and I decided to take a long walk in the chilly temperatures of the night. We talked and talked. Nothing happened until about 11:30. We were crossing the street when I heard the same exact sound, but much louder, coming from the woods down the road. I was terrified. My friend, though, paid no attention to it. We continued walking, but I was a little more paranoid than before, just waiting for something to jump out after me. An hour passed and we had to split ways. She went home and I did too. I had some instrumental music playing on my phone to keep me calm. Obviously, that didn't last long. Of course, something had to happen in the dead of night while I was alone. As I walked in the streets, I heard a baby scream, but it didn't sound normal. It was a horrifying, distorted scream. I looked in the direction of the sound and thought I saw someone there. My feet moved faster than before, trying to get me home. Then I heard another scream, much scarier than the first. I ran for it. That might not have been the best decision, but it was instinctive. Suddenly, I heard feet hitting the pavement and felt like something or someone was chasing me. I looked back quickly and thought I saw a large black figure coming, but it only lasted several seconds till I saw nothing. The shouts and screams did not stop, though. I finally got home, but I realized the door was locked and couldn't get inside. Unfortunately, those screams continued. After many calls and pressing the doorbell, my stepfather opened the door. I was a hyperventilating mess, but I got through it. I'm very spiritual and have been told by many mediums or spiritual leaders that I am a beacon for bad spirits. I assumed that it was a bad spirit, but I remember reading about wendigos, a creature that is apparently connected to me in some ways that are unknown to me. I did research again and deeply believe that whatever followed me is still watching me. I'm not sure if it's a wendigo, but it could be. Some acquaintances agree that it is quite possible. Now I'm just waiting for my next encounter with it, and I'm left wondering, what does it want, and what will it do next?
This story takes place in 2008. I was 7 years old and I lived in Beaverton, Oregon. It's a pretty nice wooded area with constantly rainy weather that boasts a population of nearly 100,000 people. While it's a nice place to live and all, the crime rates were pretty high. Almost every couple of nights, an apartment next to us would get burglarized. Local stores also were held up quite a bit. I went to a nearby school that wasn't funded very well either, as in the play equipment was worn down and the building itself was falling apart. The kids I went there were mostly kids that came from lower income families. The school was built right next to a large wooded area. The woods probably covered a full acre of land. Now, as a second grader, I absolutely loved to sneak off during recess when the teachers weren't looking and go explore this wooded area with my friends. I had 3 friends named Parker, Aaron, and Brian. They would almost always accompany me on these quick 15-minute adventures through the woods. The cool thing was that I and those 3 friends lived really close to one another, and we also lived only a block away from the school, so we found ourselves almost every day hanging out after school in this wooded area. We would usually bring out a bunch of snacks, find a comfortable place to sit, and play Mario Party DS until the sun started going down. On the last day of 2nd grade, I and my friends decided we were going to walk through the entire wooded area until we reached the other side. None of us had ever made it to the other side before. Usually we would stop 10 minutes in. Keep in mind, the trees in this area were absolutely huge. When the bell rang and the school was out of session for the summer, the 4 of us ran home pretty quickly and alerted the parents of our plans. Then we made our way where we usually met at the entrance of the wooded area. The walk was super uneventful and we found ourselves bored and rather unsettled by the silent nature of the woods. I should mention that to the right of the woods there was a large road that went straight for miles. If you were able to drive down there, it led to a very sketchy neighborhood that was notorious for its high crime rates. Quite a bit of Amber Alerts were issued in that part of town as well. Our parents all told us to avoid this part of town, not to go any further than the end of the woods. Anyway, back to the story. We made it to the end of the woods eventually, after several Mario Party sessions of course, and instead of being happy about it, we were actually quite creeped out. The sun was setting a little earlier than we had thought it would, and it would take another 40 minutes to make it to where we had started this journey. We decided we'd walk along the road I mentioned earlier, as it was getting pretty dark. Walking through an unkept wooded area at this time of night would eventually end up in bad stuff, and would definitely be really unsettling. Panic started to set in when 20 minutes later, Aaron's phone, which I believe was a Motorola Razr, this is important because he was the only kid in our group that had a phone, had died and the sun had almost set entirely. It looked like it was 9 o'clock, but it was only probably around 7. My parents had told me to be back by 6:30 as well, and with me having anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes until I was home, I was a bit anxious about my parents and how they would react to me being late. I was also nervous because I had never been in this area when it was dark. We usually made a home right when the sun started to set, so it was always at least somewhat light outside. But it was nearly pitch black out, and I knew for sure my mom and dad were worried about my whereabouts. The entire walk, not a single car had driven by us. However, about 10 minutes from the school, a very beat-up-looking Ford Escort slowly drives ahead of us. It was too dark to see anybody inside. It drives ahead of us about 20 feet before then slowing down and pulling to the side. Right when this happened, the 4 of us stopped in our tracks and watched our now fully stopped car anxiously. My gut instinct at this point was telling me that something was very wrong with this picture. A man then got out of the car of the passenger side and then started talking to somebody that was in the driver's seat before looking at the 4 of us every couple of seconds. We were frozen and hadn't said a single word since the car had pulled in front of us. The man on the passenger side of the car was a burly, tall man of probably 6'4" and 250 pounds. A couple of seconds later, we saw the man reach into the car and pull something out, before he then started running as fast as he could. We all screamed louder than we probably ever have in our lives, and ran immediately into the neighboring woods, sticking together the entire time. As we ambushed our way into the woods, we heard a man screaming angrily before, then hearing the car from earlier slam on the gas and then fade out into the distance. We hauled ass home at that point and told our parents about the incident. The local police department was alerted about the situation. However, nobody was ever caught, and nothing came from the situation afterwards. My parents became pretty strict after that night and didn't let me walk around outside without parental supervision until I was probably 11 or 12. Regardless of their decision to not let me wander around outside alone, I wouldn't have gone back to that wooded area anyway. In fact, after that night, I and my friends played video games at the house, and so we moved in 2012. Thinking about this incident today is pretty scary to think about what could have happened had we not quickly made our ways into the wood to hide. The man chasing us could have easily picked all four of us up at once, and could have just as easily stuffed us in his car. Let this story be a warning to parents who don't think their kids are in harm's way when they're playing outside alone.